Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Jim. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't. Also share the video with your friends, family, and anybody else who may be interested in these topics of history, philosophy, and theology. And if you are interested in history, philosophy, and theology, be sure to check out my book, The Misunderstood Bible, 2nd edition, available on Amazon and a few other places as well. This book covers everything in history, theology, philosophy that I just mentioned, starting with some of the earliest Greek philosophers down to the philosophy and metaphysics of the Bible itself, even as far back as the Torah, explaining the differences, the similarities, and where the line is drawn between biblical theology and Greek philosophy. Today, on the topic of theology itself, we're going to be discussing a very important and somewhat underrated topic, which is the Sabbath. Now, some of you may be aware of people called Seventh-day Adventists and other types of Hebrew roots adjacent Christians who say that they don't worship on Sunday, they don't care about the first day of the week, which is Sunday, they only want the Sabbath. And so, in addition to the Sabbath, they also have certain dietary rules where they emulate elements of the law of Moses. The reason I say elements is because, as I point out in my book, in my chapter on the law of Moses, none of these Judaizer groups are consistent enough to actually enact the judicial and moral teachings of Moses, but only take for the superficial, outward appearances such as circumcision, the refusal to eat pork and shellfish, and openly worshiping on the Sabbath rather than on the first day of the week. So those are kind of the exterior, almost aesthetical purposes of the law, but not the inward moral teaching. And that's where it's kind of flipped in the Orthodox Church, where the Orthodox Church does not command people to be circumcised, nor does it command them to abstain from pork, seeing that it has nothing to do with their salvation in the New Covenant, but that there are questions that aren't necessarily answered or clarified in the New Testament, and as such, you would have to appeal to the Old Testament for morality. So the Old Testament morality on warfare, for instance, and other issues which aren't specifically mentioned in the New Testament or are never really abrogated, you'd have to appeal to the Old Testament for. So that's the difference, where you have the Orthodox Church saying the morality of the Old Testament is fine, but we're not going to do the exterior appearances just to say that we're Judaizers. And then you have the Judaizers who say essentially that they're ignoring the moral parts of the Old Testament, but they are keeping stuff like refusal to eat pork and refusal to have shellfish and refusal to believe in any other what they call innovations. So that's kind of the difference, just to start off, what is going on between the Judaizer groups and then a church like the Orthodox Church. This also applies for the Oriental Orthodox. And for anybody in the comments who are going to bring up the Tewahedos, as far as I have seen, the Tewahedos don't do any of those practices that are usually accused of them being Judaizers, such as not eating pork and shellfish and worshiping on the Sabbath. I don't, or at least resting on the Sabbath, I don't find them to be Judaizer at all. Part of those are just local culture. So the circumcision happens to be common in most of Africa and the Middle East, and that's just how it's always been. And then in terms of the pork and the shellfish, it's not a salvific issue for them either. So it wouldn't make sense to say the Ethiopian churches are Judaizers or something, because they don't hold it for salvation. I make that very clear again in my book on the law of Moses. But concerning the Sabbath, there seems to be a lot of confusion in the Christian world. Right, on one end, you have the Seventh-day Adventists and the Hebrew roots guys saying that we have to try our best to emulate the Sabbath of the Torah in the exact ways that Exodus and other texts of the Torah mention the Sabbath. Then you have people who, especially in the English-speaking world, seem to think the entirety of the Sabbath is just done away with and nobody follows it whatsoever. It's not important. It's just been completely replaced by Sunday. And so you have this back and forth where you have the Christians of these types, usually again speaking in English, and there's a reason for that, saying, hey, we don't have the Sabbath, we have Sunday. And then the Judaizers biting back and saying, oh, you worship on the day of the sun and some other pagan innovation stuff. The truth is actually somewhere more in the middle. As usual, we have extreme positions on both sides, which are not representative of the Old Testament, the New Testament, or the church historically. So I'm just going to say it right now. The Orthodox Church does in fact observe the Sabbath as well as the Lord's Day. So the Lord's Day is Sunday. That's when most people go and they attend the Divine Liturgy, and that is the official Divine Liturgy of the week. Now, if you're Roman Catholic, you're going to have a Novus Ordo Mass many other days of the week, so there's not as much emphasis on the Lord's Day as in the Orthodox Church. But The Lord's Day is the day for worship. That's when you take the Eucharist, etc. There is, however, a Vespers, the evening before that, and that is kind of the beginning of this period of rest. So for those who are unaware, first of all, the Orthodox Church doesn't officially accept the Western use of time, right? The Western use of time, wherein the day begins at midnight. The Orthodox Church doesn't believe in that. The Orthodox Church also doesn't believe that the day begins at sunrise. The Orthodox Church historically always believed that the day begins at sunset, just as it did in the Old Testament. I mean, the very first book in Genesis, it says, there was evening and there was morning. That was the first day, not morning and evening. And of course, all the laws concerning ritual cleanliness and other ceremonies in the Torah are commanded to go until the evening, then you become clean. Because the evening is a new day, according to God, according to the Hebrews who followed God, according to the Old Testament, which is in all of our Bibles. Secondly, the Sabbath, Saturday, is considered a time when you're not even supposed to fast. So it's not just a recommendation. You should not fast on the Sabbath. And the Orthodox Church recognizes that the Sabbath is not Sunday. It is the day before Sunday. So you have Sabbath, which is Saturday, and then you have Sunday, which is the Lord's Day. And as you can see in some sources that I'm going to display on the screen, this is historic. It's not just me coming up with some last-minute argument based on some teaching thousands of years ago that people forgot. This is just how the Orthodox Church has always operated. So if you're Orthodox Christian, you do in fact observe the Sabbath, but you don't do it in the manner of the exact law of Moses or the Sinai covenant. That's because Christ himself says that he's, in the story where he's picking grain on the Sabbath, he says that he is Lord of the Sabbath, and the Sabbath was made for man and not the other way around. So Sabbath is meant for us to relax on. They may say, well, he never specifically states that we need to have a new kind of Sabbath different than the Sinai covenant. But I would say actually he doesn't need to, for multiple reasons. The Sabbath is not invented in the Sinai covenant. It's actually found in the rest of the Torah. So the Sabbath comes about at the very start of creation, as a matter of fact. And all of the prophets leading up to Moses knew what the Sabbath was, but they did not practice it with the extreme attention to detail as people in the Sinai covenant did. So there's a period in time where we have the Sinai covenant up until the new covenant. And in that time period, you can be, let's say, punished for breaking some of the smaller rules of the Sabbath, which is regarded with a more extreme look than prior to the law of Moses. But people often forget, because the Torah is much more fast-paced than the historical book, so much more time takes place in much less pages, that for thousands of years people existed on earth without the quote law of Moses, but with other laws, the Sabbath being one of those. And so this natural ordinance was given to all the prophets, including Abraham, and yet Abraham's never commanded to stone somebody who picks up a stick on the Sabbath. That was only for the Sinai covenant. And as Jeremiah 31 says, we're going to be in a brand new covenant where the law and the way in which we behave is going to be different, such that in the New Testament, Jesus abrogates the Mosaic law version of divorce, not just because he's doing it willy-nilly, but because he says that it was not always this way. So the law of Moses was made specifically, all right, the Sinai covenant in particular, was made specifically for the Israelites because of their hard-necked nature, as the Old Testament says. So they have a very strict ordinance, a very strict set of laws that the nations around them are not obligated to keep in the way that they're obligated to keep. They're set to a standard higher than the Edomites and the Egyptians. And when the Sinai covenant is over and we're in the new covenant, that standard is not kept for members of the new covenant. They'll follow aspects of the law, but in a way, in a modulation different than what was found in the Sinai covenant. So yes, the Orthodox Church, the Oriental Church, and even traditional Catholics will say that Saturday is Sabbath and that you do observe Sabbath. But in the Latin Catholic Church, they do at times fast on the Sabbath. So they don't have that kind of, more official stance that the East would have, which is that you shouldn't fast on it because it's a day of rest, so you have to be unburdened. But some Catholics will fast on the Sabbath. In any event, there is the Sabbath found in all the traditional churches, just not the rabbinic Jewish Sabbath or the Sabbath of the Sinai covenant. In addition to that, the reason I mentioned the English language is because pretty much everybody outside of the English-speaking world is aware that Saturday is the Sabbath. Okay, it's called Sábado in Spanish, maybe Sábado, so forgive my pronunciation there. Same with Portuguese and a variety of other languages. It's the day for Saturday is literally called Sabbath. The same thing applies to Easter. Only in English do we call this holiday Easter. It's not called Easter in other languages. Even Iceland, which is so far removed from the rest of Europe that I wouldn't even consider it part of the European continent. I don't think anybody else would either. Their day for Easter is called Pascha. Number one, they aren't Orthodox. Number two, most of them are irreligious today. And number three, they're so far away from Europe, you would think they'd come up with some fairy pagan mythology because they believe in that stuff. But
yeah, I mean, if you, from a pagan perspective, you start realizing that that's literally what happened. They whenever they talk about idols, like basically people would make idols of their ancestors, and then whenever they would have dinner and stuff, they would have a little sculpture of their grandfather. Well, the Christians came in and destroyed all that, and so basically they cut us off from our. I know I started to sound like we was kings and shit. I know.
No, I know, but no, I get it. Yeah, ancestor cry. No, they don't even call it Easter. So I think a lot of the problems of communication come from the English-speaking world abandoning calling Saturday Sabbath, and number two, calling Easter Pascha. But anyway, so that's this. If you're in the Orthodox Church, you do in fact follow the Sabbath. And by the way, a day begins at sunset. So when you wake up and you say good morning, that's not a new day. A new day is the evening. And so that is technically when your fasting should expire as well. And that's the rule of time for the Orthodox Church. That's the rule of time for the Sabbath. And many people have asked me about the Law of Moses, which I've covered at length on this channel in my book. And essentially the answer is the law is not totally rolled up and thrown in the garbage. It's not just gone completely. But the way in which you do it is altered for the new covenant. And there's many things that you can't do, right? There's laws made specifically for the land of Canaan, which you don't live in, right? There are laws which are made for a type of building that we do not have. And there are laws of atonement, which we do not need because we already have the Son of God who did that for us. So we have no need for large parts of the law, but parts of the law that are still active are still understood in a different way in the new covenant, the Sabbath being one of those. So thank you guys very much for watching. Please remember to like, comment, subscribe. Share the video with those who you think would be interested. And remember to pick up a copy of my book, The Misunderstood Bible, 2nd edition. And yes, I will keep mentioning it in every video. Have a good day, which by the way, remember, ends at sunset.